Okay, we should make a start. My name's John Deering. I'm one of the co-chairs of the university's Sustainability Science Research Group, and very pleased to welcome everybody here in the audience and people who are watching on our live feed. What we're doing tonight is celebrating the UN's Development Information Day, and we thought we would do that by showcasing some of the research that we've been doing in the last 2 years or so, much of it to do with ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, funded by a programme of the same name, funded by NERC and ESRC and the Department for International Development. And so that's what it is tonight. It's a few talks from the different projects that we have. We're going to try and move through them quite quickly, but there will be time in the middle of the session to have some questions, and again at the end. And we'll have a short break in the middle as a kind of short comfort break. But I'm going to pass now to Felix Eigenbrod, who's the other co-chair of our Sustainability Science Group, and he's going to do the introduction to the speakers.
Thank you very much, John. So the program today is that we have, I believe, 7 talks, each of 15 minutes length. If we go for the speakers, I'll wave a 5-minute warning sign at you with obviously 5 minutes to go. And I think the plan is that we have 4 talks to have the 5-minute break and then have the remaining 3 talks then. So we'll try to keep quite a tight schedule because we don't have a massive amount of extra time. So I've had the pleasure to introduce for our first speaker today is the director of ESPA, Paul van Gardingen. Paul is holds a professorship at UNESCO Chair of International Development, and is director of ecosystem services for poverty alleviation for ESPA. And he also acts as in an advisory capacity at the Global Development Academy, and his own particular research interests focus on ensuring that science, technology, and innovation contribute to global international development. And he has extensive field and research experience in Southeast Asia and Africa. So without further ado, Paul, please take it away.
Right. Okay. Right, where are they?
Sorry, I've got. Sorry. They're here.
Ah.
And they live in here. Closest one.
Gotcha.
There we go. There. Oh, no. That's wrong.
Oh, that's it. There it is.
Brilliant.
Cool. Okay, thanks. And it's the second time in the last month that I've been able to start a talk by saying, hey, it's fantastic, I'm surrounded by the family of ESPA. And coming to Southampton is great because the university here has got a number of ESPA projects, really exciting projects. And I thought rather than talk about what ESPA aspires to do and do the boring things, hey, it's the evening. So let's have a picture show about what ESPA means in practice. And I want to do it by illustrating some of the projects, some of the really great projects which are happening here, and actually probably encapsulates very much what ESPA is trying to achieve. But starting point, ESPA has been going for over 5 years now, though the main project's only for the last couple of years. And I was involved in the original design, and during that process, my own thinking about the links between ecosystem services for poverty alleviation changed. And this is a picture that I took in Kenya at one of the points when we were at an important decision-making time in terms of ESPA, thinking about what we're trying to achieve and what it really means. This is a community who really are having a hard time. They've been shifted off their land to create a game park. They used to have relatively reliable water. Now the only thing they have is this well. It's unreliable. So basically, they were getting poorer, their lives were getting more difficult, as an elite group captured other ecosystem services through a game park. And that's the situation that we see in many places, is that there is conflict over ecosystem services. That the poorest people get a pretty raw deal in many cases. So ESPA was created to turn that around, and it was trying to understand how can we use ecosystem services to alleviate poverty. ESPA is not a conservation program. It's not about conserving ecosystems. It's not about conserving the lesser spotted green tree frog. It's about using ecosystems, the services and the benefits derived from that to improve people's lives. ESPA is also a research program. As is pointed out, it brings together two of the UK's research councils, the Natural Environment and Economic and Social Research Council, with DFID, and they're joined in a single purpose, which is to create world-class research which has the potential to change lives. But it's research in a different way. And here, these are a couple of pictures from Bolivia from one of our projects. On the left-hand side is a notebook that the Research Council UK team in India had given to me, which has got their motto, which is excellence with impact. And that's what ESPA's about. We want the best research. Why? Because that's the research which is going to make the biggest difference. But it has to be research which has the potential to change lives. On the right-hand side is a community from called the Juntas community in Bolivia. And this illustrates one of the ways that we do this, is we do fantastic research, but we involve local communities. And that's something which I know is happening with a lot of the work happening here in Southampton as well. It also needs to change lives. This picture comes from a community on the coast in Kenya, just outside Mombasa, a little place called Giza Bay. It's a project from Napier University along with the Kenyan Marine and Fisheries Research Institute there. And they are using 10 years of research and are now working with this community with private sector funding to do one of the world's first carbon finance-based restoration of mangroves, lots of benefits in terms of fisheries, livelihoods, etc. Really quite exciting. And that is all based on research, but most importantly, research which is led by a local researcher. And as recognition of it, he's got the best title I've got. He got given the Kenyan Order of the Burning Spear by the President of Kenya. I want one. Just imagine putting that on your wall. We also are very interested in using our research to inform debate. And this is one of our projects. I can't remember, Kate, were you involved in this one at all? This was a debate in India about using some of the research there from a project to talk about issues relating to equity and fairness in the allocation of ecosystem services. It comes down to generating world-class research papers. Southampton is a leading university in the UK and internationally. The purpose of being here is to generate world-class research, and that's exactly why projects have come here, is the ability to do that. But that evidence needs to be relevant to a guy like this. It's a fisherman on one of the main rivers in Mali. How do we make research change lives? And that's one of the things which makes ESPA exciting. And I had to see this, right? Bringing together adventurous minds to achieve the impossible. Can we borrow that? Because that's about where we're at. Is it impossible to make research papers relevant to people like this? I hope not, because that's what we aspire to do. And that's what the research teams here aspire to do. And we're beginning to see it. If we look at some of the impact we've got, these are on our website. I've missed off one deliberately. The one on the right is the one from Bolivia I showed you, the mangrove one, and another. But what I want to do now is just to move and talk about some of the really exciting work that researchers, students here are doing as part of this growing ESPA family. Now, when I talk about this ESPA family, let me give you some numbers. If we look at the number of researchers around the world that have interacted with ESPA, we've funded now around about, I think we're pushing about 500 researchers in total. If we expand that to people who've either applied or have reviewed, I think it's currently something like between 3,000 and 5,000 researchers have interacted with ESPA in some way. So it is a truly international program. Okay, time to embarrass everybody. This was one of our nice big early successes. I'm really good, isn't it? Researchers here do it, I claim it as an ESPA success. But this paper came in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year, and people have been really excited about it. And John will be talking about it later. It's looking at trends in ecosystem services and how that relates to poverty alleviation in China. And now the work is getting extended out into other regions, particularly Bangladesh, through one of the new projects. It's looking at an ecosystem service index, which John describes as a little bit like the Dow Jones index. I'm using your slides, aren't I? But it's great because it says, as in this case, GDP increases, ecosystems are degraded in this particular context. There's also an association with population increase. So these bits of evidence are really, really important. So, we've got an impact note on it. In April, DIF had put it up on their website, highlighting our research as being relevant to development. Today we're talking on UN's Development Day. Here's an example of ESPA research done here, published in one of the world's leading journals, open access so anybody can get it. This is exactly what we want to see ESPA projects do. Last year, we completed commissioning 3 large, very ambitious projects. These are interdisciplinary, large projects, mix of data collection, analysis, modelling, etc. 2 of those 3 came here. And earlier this year I had the pleasure of visiting parts of each of the teams. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. Unfortunately for the ESPA DELTAS project, there wasn't any field work going, but we had another project there. This is in the Sundarbans in the Deltas region. For me, it was really telling to hear local communities say why ESPA's research was important. Went to this little community, and on one side of the room, there were a bunch of farmers saying after the cyclone 5 years ago, they haven't been able to grow their crops anymore. And there's a whole series of biophysical reasons about this. And the project here is trying to understand what these changes have meant, what's led up to that, and also what future scenarios may look in. So that was that one side. The unexpected was this side. This was the really upsetting part of it. All of these women are tiger widows. They've lost husbands and sons to conflict with tigers over the last few years because the tigers also don't have anything to eat. I sat up there and they said, right, you've got this huge research program. What are you going to do for us? And I didn't have an easy answer. Except for to say, but we've actually funded Robert Nichols and his team to generate some research which is actually addressing these issues about how do communities in these delta regions become more resilient to a changing world. So I said, we don't have the results yet, but we will soon. Kate's project has been running a bit longer, which is looking at equity. And I borrowed one of her slides. If you can see it, it says Project Carbon Fund. It's saying, is it fair? Is RED, this new global system for carbon finance, is it actually fair to local communities? Or are elite groups going to capture that? Also of interest to UK policymakers. This is Barry Gardiner from memory at a meeting in Costa Rica where UK parliamentarians went there to talk to local stakeholders, the parliament there, and they heard about research generated by ESPA, which is fantastic. And The last project is Assets, which is mainly in Colombia and Malawi. And I'm not sure if this will work, but oh yeah, it might. Have you actually got sound on here? This community that project is building on a lot of experience with one of the partners, which is SEAT. And this was one of the locations where I saw examples of getting it right. 10 years ago, this community was really failing after coffee failed. And they went to an ecosystem-based management. They used a prototype payment for ecosystem service scheme and put trees on the landscape, diversified. Now they no longer need to use pesticides. Their productivity is higher than it used to be. They've got more cattle on the landscape. They're diversifying to having shade-grown coffee, etc. And it's a huge success story. And what this one said is, whereas earlier I was saying, there's lots of challenges, here is already an example of where this ecosystem-based approach is providing communities with ways out of poverty. And what the Assets project is doing is saying, okay, this has worked at a small scale in one location. What about at this really difficult place, which is the forest agriculture interface in Colombia and the Amazon, but also what's happening in Malawi, where these communities have already effectively gone over what we'd call a tipping point, very difficult to recover because you've had over-exploitation. And again, really interesting piece of research. But the great thing here is it's already got examples of what can be done when you get it right. But that's the point I'll stop. If you want, there's a video behind this which is available on our website. You could probably cross-link to it if you like. But I think the best thing would be to hear about the projects themselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's fantastic. The next talk we have is, the next talks are all from University of Southampton staff. And the next talk we have is from Guy Poppy. I'll just quickly introduce you, Guy. So Guy is a professor here at Southampton, based in biological sciences, but he's also the lead of the multidisciplinary research at Southampton. So the multidisciplinary research agenda is led by Guy, of which sustainability science at Southampton is just one of the many groupings. He's a chemical ecologist by original training, but has now moved into trying to answer this grand challenge of how we can feed the world's population without completely mucking up our ecosystems. So I'll let Guy take you away from there.
That's not a tough challenge. Well, thank you. I apologise, I have to rush off because my son is participating in the United Nations geography competition in Hampshire schools. I'm not too sure whether he's going to allow me to turn up, but you might need to phone a friend. So I have to leave after my talk. I do apologise for that. So our team is a number of organisations across the world, including universities in the key areas we're working, which is in Colombia and Malawi, and a number of research institutions in those countries too, plus organisations such as Conservation International, who are based in Washington DC but work across the world, and Rhodes University, World Fish Lead, etc. So as you can see, it's a very, very multinational team. But also we have representations from natural scientists, social scientists, agronomists, ecologists, economists, etc. So we actually span the full disciplines. So as Felix highlighted, actually the United Nations Environmental Programme 2011 stated how food security was a big driver in landscape land use change. And at the same time, it was also recognised, as shown in their report here, that to achieve food security, and we're focusing on food and nutritional as a good measure of that, in terms of agriculture, ecosystems relied on a number of ecosystem services providing service to it, and also had influence on a number of ecosystem services. So we have this situation in which, by focusing in on this agricultural ecosystem at this agricultural forest interface, which I'll tell you a little bit more, we are sitting in the middle of ecosystem services influencing that and being influenced by it. And I think that is kind of what led us to our overarching goal of our project, which was to explicitly quantify the linkages that I've just described in the United Nations last summer in their key report came out, between the natural ecosystems that affect and are affected by food security and nutritional health for the rural poor, the forest agricultural interface. And this is the area of Lower Caquetá in the Amazonas region in Colombia, with some sort of participatory work showing how they kind of assess their ecosystem, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But this is a very remote part of the world which has had very little disturbance, certainly since Christopher Columbus's debates as to whether there was disturbance pre that, but certainly in the last 500 or 600 years there's been very little disturbance. In fact, if you miss the plane, it's an 8-day boat trip to get to this area, so there are some pretty remote places on Earth, including where we are going to be working. So if you take this situation and you try to draw up an example of an agricultural forest interface, this is a very simplistic representation, but you very quickly identify a whole range of exogenous and endogenous drivers which influence that, and start to map out all the sorts of interactions which are going to be important if you want to try and manage this system and understand how it works, and therefore potentially be able to inform and advise decision makers and on policy. How do we kind of do that? It's a very, very complex situation, something which can be maybe modelled, but then how do you actually understand the various social drivers and the actual policy responses of a complex scenario like that? Well, first thing you're going to do is you're going to have to be realistic about choosing sites which you can work in, and in that we based our work on the fact that we had good connections, as you saw in our team, and very good field sites which we could work in sub-Saharan Africa, using Malawi as an example, which, as Paul's described, somewhat down the pathway from deforestation towards a clear landscape, perhaps beyond a tipping point, as against the Caquetá area in the Amazon, where the two sites there represent one zone, which is relatively undisturbed, this 8-day boat trip to get to, and another area which is what we might be called the frontier zone. It's a zone where there's a lot of activity, a lot of deforestation, a lot of infiltration from human disturbance, etc. It's the sort of place that I did offer to give my daughter a field trial experience there. My wife banned me from sending her to the heart of Colombia at this frontier zone. I don't quite know why, but anyhow, it's a very interesting place to work because it represents something that's happening in the Amazon, especially in Brazil, in a big way. So it's a very good site to work in. Colombia is a very biodiverse region too. So we decided to do that by using the DIPSEER framework, which would enable us to get to that complex system and be able to integrate the disciplines that we need to integrate. And for those who are not familiar with that, it's a widely used tool in environmental science, which has been able to link science with decision making and policy. And how that works is you have a situation in which you understand the drivers and the pressures in your system, which you can combine natural and social science approaches to, and I'll briefly tell you how we do that. And then you can use a range of modelling tools to look at the states and impacts which will happen according to those drivers and pressures. And then finally, which is the bit which is often forgotten about, is the R of that, the response, in terms of how you actually use this information you're gathering to perhaps influence the drivers and pressures, and therefore translate your world-class research into something which has impact. So we broke that DIPSEER frame, and the reason I'm talking about what we're going to be doing is the project's only been running a few months. And as you can imagine, with a complex project like this, what I'm outlining to you is what we will be doing and some of the initial work that we've been doing. It's not going to be full of results. If you came back in 4 years' time, then I'd be able to give you a 4-hour talk full of results. But at this stage, I'm going to describe what we're doing. So the first theme, as I said, is identifying these drivers and pressures, and we will be doing that using both qualitative and quantitative social science methods and some ecological modelling. So participatory research is going to generate a lot of qualitative information by using focus groups and seasonal calendars, etc. And Kate Schreckenberg and Carlos, who's in the audience, produced have been working in Malawi recently, training a number of field workers in terms of trying to actually take part in participatory rural appraisals. And there is Carlos in the picture in the white shirt there, working with a group of villagers in Malawi in terms of beginning to identify, for instance, here is a drawing of a kind of a ranking exercise in terms of key services and how they would actually score those in terms of one service or one goods and benefits, and we'll talk about those details later, but we haven't got great time to do that. But this is the sort of qualitative information which begins to give you an idea of how a community value the world around them, what's important to them, and how they kind of cope. And for instance, you can draw up maps like this which begin to give you an indication of where they get their goods and benefits from. And then you can obviously overlay that with actual geographical information to be able to give you distances and therefore flows and that which are very important in terms of mapping ecosystem services. One of the kind of ecological aspects we can look at these drivers and pressures is using FeedMe as a model, which is basically a model developed by Terry Dawson using FAO data to look at where there will be calorific shortfalls in the world. This model's mainly been done at a country level. During our project, we're going to scale it down to the operational level of the regions we work in, which will make it more relevant to the communities which we work with. And then finally, the quantitative social science aspect is like household surveys, food security, in which diaries are kept by a smaller subset of the community, beginning to identify what food they use, how much they use, and what decision-making they make in set periods of time during that particular survey. And then the various nutritional measures can be made too. So that tells us a lot about the drivers and pressures, driven by pressures in terms of calorific pressures, drivers and drivers and pressures in terms of people's behaviours and how they use various things and where they might go and get things. With that information, we're obviously interested in looking at the crises and tipping points, both in the past and the present, and more importantly, into the future, which is going to be important in terms of us beginning to use our knowledge to help provide impact beyond academic journals where we can. And in this, we will be using a cutting-edge modelling tool called ARES, which is a spatial assessment tool. And then one of the key things about ARES is it actually begins to separate out the flows from the sinks and the provisionings. And it's an important aspect of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, which ESPA has taken one step further, in which this separation of the service from the goods and benefits. And I think ecosystem services is going quite down a more economic way of looking at some of these things, perhaps whereas it was coming from a very ecological viewpoint initially. And there was always a bit of a conflict in the issue in terms of it only is a service if it benefits man, and therefore by separating out the goods and benefits it can make some of that a little bit easier to do. And in terms of trade-offs between various goods and benefits, because you can then, they might be coming from the same service, which again makes it difficult in terms of that trade-off analysis. And here are the components of this ARES system, which is basically a way in which you can integrate a number of other models. So one of the big problems in this area is if you've got lots of services and lots of models, is how you develop a big systems-based type model which enables talk across those particular models. And one of the things we hope to do with ARES is to be able to do that, which enables us to be able to look at these areas of critical flow. I.e., I describe this as if you know where benefits and that are coming from and where the flows are, if I was to drive from here to Scotland, if certain roads are closed, it wouldn't trouble me. On the other hand, if Spaghetti Junction got blocked up, it would have massive implications. And therefore, I think beginning to identify where the areas of critical flow might be to a number of goods and benefits can enable the next stage, the response, to become quite important, because you can begin to put your efforts into perhaps managing areas where there's critical flow. And so this is the science policy interface, which is the last part of our DIPSIA framework, the response side of things, in which we're looking at issues in terms of how we minimise the risk of future changes and how we might influence policy to better manage some of these conflicts and trade-offs. And there are various tools we can use. This is a tool which was used by Shell Oil Company in the 80s to look at the consequences of oil disasters, and it's been used a little bit in agriculture for looking at things like genetic modification and the implications of that. But it's a system in which you can begin to put barriers in place to stop events from happening, or put barriers in place to stop, to mitigate against the consequence of something. And we're thinking of not only using this as a risk tool, but as a benefit tool, because we can maybe look at flows which we'd want to be happening, which have a barrier, and we pull them away, whereas normally in risks you're putting barriers in place. And so this science policy interface, we've already started thinking right at the outset of our project as to how the information that we will be generating can lead to not only food security and nutritional health on the ground, but better resource management. So we have ecosystem services for poverty alleviation in terms of food security and nutritional health, which are just one measure of poverty alleviation, but they're very, they interact with many, many others too. And we're very fortunate in which the team we're working with in Colombia, in Caquetá, the development plan for Caquetá Department in Colombia, 2012 to 2015, has actually incorporated our project and the results that we will be generating into their development plan. I am told that what it basically says is that we'll be giving key inputs, and I didn't do this on that babblefish or whatever it's called, this is a genuine Colombian person who translated this for me, is it gives key inputs to contribute to better management of the Caquetá environmental resources, to analyse links between ecosystem services that have a role in food security, nutritional health of the rural poor, etc. So we were really, really excited when this happened, and when we were in Malawi, because this has happened right at the start of our project, when we were in Malawi last week, we've started trying to do similar things there in terms of their policies are beginning to be formed, and we did some television work and some newspaper coverage, etc. So we think it's very important, if you want to do this, okay, we think it's important to start now and not wait until you end the project, and that is that we're at our consortium, and you'll have to take my word on this, but in 4 years you can judge it, is we will undertake world-class research on ecosystem services for poverty alleviation at the forest agriculture interface, and that's what we intend to do. But we will deliver evidence, as you can see from the way we're approaching it, from a range of sources and in various formats, which should enable us to help inform policy and potentially promote aspects in terms of behavioural change or ideas in which might address how things can maybe move forward. And that our case study sites involve 2 million people, but the agricultural forest interface in the world is where 550 million people live. So the Deltas project coming next will tell you they have 500 million living in Deltas.
560 actually.
Oh, is it? Oh, sorry. Okay, but I mean, joking apart, the fact is, I think we as a team are really pleased about the possibility to do some work which, as Paul demonstrated there, hopefully is excellent, but will have impact. And I thank you from the Assets team, and this is from the workshop in Zomba that happened 2 weeks ago. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The next person we have talking today is Professor John Deering, who's in geography. And John, I believe, leads 2 ESPA projects and is involved in another, which may be some sort of ESPA record, I'm not sure. And he'll be talking about those today. John's research interests include global environmental change, particularly the integration of climate, human activities, and environmental processes, reconstructing long-term environmental change and ecological services through lake sediments, and understanding the complexity of modern and future environmental systems from past records and modelling. So I'll leave John to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Felix. I want to talk about a project. It's quite a small project. It's not one of the consortia grants, but its title is Safe Operating Spaces for Regional Rural Development. And when you look at the ESPA programme, it basically captures 2 main themes, that of environmental degradation on the one hand and human deprivation on the other. We're using the planet's resources in a totally unsustainable way, and yet we still have millions of people who lie below or just at the poverty line. And of course it's those poor people who often suffer the conflicts when that environmental degradation impacts on their livelihoods. So we can see land-water conflicts, we can see the crises that come about through food price hikes, and all of those we've seen recently in headlines. So this project is really trying to answer a question that gets to the heart of that issue, and that is, can we devise a tool that allows us to plan for sustainable development but within safe environmental limits? And this has partly been triggered by previous work. So just a couple of years ago, there was a paper published by a group led by Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and they came up with this kind of spiderweb diagram, which shows how how humanity has essentially exploited Earth system resources in 9 different categories, such that the red sectors show where we have effectively large uses of these benefits moving outside of that green zone in the middle, which would be the safe limit. So we can see here that the nitrogen cycle, biodiversity, are 2 of those particular parts of the Earth system which have exceeded, in their judgment, some kind of limit. And what they mean by that is some kind of almost irreversible threshold change. And biodiversity, nitrogen, climate, based on the idea of abrupt changes, or tipping points, if you want to put it that way. That's for the biophysical side. When it comes to thinking about society, then Kate Raworth in Oxfam has also put her mind to this and said, well, what the Rockström plan does is to kind of define a safe operating space for humanity. It's like saying, let's keep within these biophysical limits. But what she says is that we could go further, and we could actually add to that diagram a kind of what she calls the social foundation. So we could actually begin to think about how these different aspects of society are linked in with the biophysical constraints that run around the outside, such that we would like everybody to have a minimum foundation of social benefit, but lie within the constraints imposed by the biophysical constraints on the environment. And it's becoming in the literature known as the donut, because it's all about trying to get everybody, in a very simplistic way, to live within this donut part of the diagram. And so in practice, looking at various statistics within a region, we could look at, say, the percentage of people who have an income that lies below a set target income for alleviating poverty. We could look at the percentage of people that still need to be educated to become literate. And that seems to be quite a profitable approach. So what this project we're trying to do is to bring these 2 ideas together, the biophysical on the one hand and the social on the other. And it raises some challenges, probably less so with regards to the social and economic centre part of the donut, because in many areas there are reasonable statistics that can at least provide a first shot at filling up those sectors. But much more difficult at a regional level is to define what the environmental ceiling is for the biophysical environment, or the boundaries on those biophysical conditions. So that's what we are doing currently. I just want to show you some of the results. What we've done to start off with is to think about some of the theoretical ways you could actually define a boundary. And this is just a simple little cartoon, really, that says, well, you know, if you can look at how a variable of interest, so this might be biodiversity or water quality or some part of the environment that you're interested in protecting, then, you know, when it starts to change, when it starts to degrade rapidly to some undesirable point, then that may be the point where you say, you know, that's the regional boundary, we want to step back from that. And you can actually use those kinds of records to say, well, when we move outside the long-term variability, that would also be a regional boundary. And there are some theories that would argue as the system starts to wobble and start to vary a lot, that should be a worrying sign that you've gone over some kind of boundary. And indeed, if you know that a threshold change has taken place, then you might be going into some irreversible state. Then that too would represent the definition of a boundary, such that if you can do this, you could identify a safe operating space well back from those boundaries, a kind of cautious intermediate space, and of course the red, dangerous operating space. So this is our kind of theoretical structure, and what we've been trying to do is get the data to prove the point. And we've been looking at some sites in China, and in this lower Yangtze area, that's the coastline on the right-hand side with Shanghai and Nanjing inland. And this is an area with lots of environmental issues. There's flooding, there's eutrophication of water bodies, there's a lot of soil erosion in the mountains, as well as a big urbanization issue, and also long-distance effects, such as the Three Gorges Dam, changes at the coastline, and the demographics are changing. They're changing particularly through internal migration from rural to urban areas, and the demography is one, as in many parts of the world, it's becoming a more aged population, and particularly here in rural areas. So we're trying to get a handle on the links between the biophysical and the social. The question is, where do we get long-term records for our ecological and environmental conditions? And what we've turned to are lake sediments. So these are the muds that accumulate at the bottom of lakes, and you can see pictures there of people taking cores of them, and pictures of the cores themselves here, extruded from plastic pipes. And when you analyse these muds in layers, you can build up a history of not just the lake, but of the surrounding catchment. And this is just a diagram to show the kinds of information one can get about the changes in the sediment source, the changes in the catchment's biodiversity and ecology, also the lake ecology. We can use something like 50 different analyses can be made on lake sediments to give us a comprehensive view of ecological changes. I just want to show you just one example of this and how it feeds into this insight on boundary conditions. And that's this one from a lake where we have, going back to 1900, so 1900 on the left and present day here, that dark blue line represents our reconstruction of water quality in the lake. And you can see that it went past what we think is a tipping point. In other words, it went over a threshold point in the early 90s. Interestingly, when you look at those three other curves, that's population, that's fertilizer, and the GDP, there's no obvious trigger for that change. And it's probably one of these tipping points that comes as a result of a complex set of interactions. So multiple drivers are kind of pushing this system. It's getting lower and lower resilience, and eventually it goes over a tipping point. And so this is quite a good example. And if we look at some of the statistics of the data in the record leading up to that, and here we have just the standard deviation of that blue line, we can see that the levels started to rise about 30 or 40 years before the tipping point actually came about. And in the literature, this is argued that this could well represent an early warning signal that the system is becoming more and more unstable as it approaches this threshold. And so it may be that we can use similar early warning signals as to identify in other lakes that have not yet been fully polluted to the point of crashing, that is actually a process that is ongoing. And so what we've done is to just jump to a final slide, really, and that is that we've taken one of the what the Chinese refer to as a poverty-stricken county. So this is the poorest county, or one of the poorest county types in the region, called Shusheng. And what we've just done is to bring all our information together to try for the first time to construct a kind of planetary boundaries diagram and a donut put together. And so we've got here, using official records, some of these data for income. So this is showing that not everybody has yet reached the kind of minimum income level set by the national government. Food accessibility is virtually reaching the minimum in this county. Health is virtually there. Education still has some way to go. And of these, sanitation, the access to toilet facilities that are linked to mains sewage, there's still a lot of households that don't have that facility. And then on the right-hand side, we can see that using our lake sediments particularly, we can see that water quality has degraded over our limit, and that's the data that I showed. So this sector here, this curve here is actually that blue curve that we saw in the previous diagram. And you can see that soil stability has also exceeded what we believe to be a desirable limit, and likewise air quality has exceeded the desirable limit. And if you put these two sets of data together in this way, then you get certain implications. For instance, we can now see that there's a link up between the need for sanitation within this county, but on the other hand, the water quality has already gone over some critical limit. So to actually bring new sanitation measures will have to be dealt with very carefully in terms of the treatment of the existing water supplies. And when you think that this region in the eastern part of China is part of the Chinese boom, you know, it's a very strong economic area, then we have issues of urbanisation and the demands of those urban areas on the local counties to supply food. And we can see that soil stability, biodiversity levels are really about as bad as you'd want them to be anyway. And so with the future projections of urbanisation in Shanghai, Nanjing and other centres, really asking that question is going to be, or dealing with that question, addressing that question is going to be quite important. So finally, the creation of safe and just operating spaces at regional scales we think is a feasible idea, but we're certainly going to have to do more research to define clearly what the boundaries are in any particular location. Certainly, if you have long environmental records, it at least allows you kind of retrospective assessment of limits, boundaries and tipping points. And in our studies, lake sediment records have been really useful in providing that information. And what we're hoping to do is to apply these approaches to the two consortia projects that we have here in Southampton and other ESPA projects during the course of this small grant that we have. And I'd like to thank everybody at the workshop we ran in July. We had a number of people coming from different parts of the country and also from Europe, and particularly Kate Raworth and Zhangke and Rong in the audience here, who have provided slides and data for this presentation. Thanks very much.
So I'm Craig Hutton. I'm here in this department. One of the people who's actually part of the Geography and Environment Academic Unit. And I'm also part of something called the Geodata Institute. I have two roles within one of the consortium bids. The Delta bid, the ESPA DELTAS bid. My first role is as the research coordinator. So it's my task to try to sort of herd cats, to get this idea into one place and coordinate it. We developed this idea, Professor Robert Nichols and I, some time ago. We've been working on it for quite a while. And so there's this conceptual framework that we're trying to pull together within this project. John Deering, as he mentioned, is working with us on this project as well. So we have the benefit of some of the historical context of ESPA. An additional role for me is that I work on poverty and vulnerability mapping, and there's lots of opportunity in this for us to do research which centres on this idea of what is the relationship between ecosystem services and poverty.
We all understand it exists. I think nobody would argue that there wasn't a relationship. But one of the things we're trying to do, and I think you've seen that in the previous projects, and one of the great things about being here in Southampton is that there's going to be such an opportunity, investment in this ability here in this university, is to actually try to quantify those relationships in a way that decision makers are able to utilize. And I think that that's a critical point. This has got to be something that's applied. It's got to be something that decision makers are able to use. Okay, so as mentioned, there's a group of people we worked with for a while. It's quite a substantial project. It has, I think, 8 or 9 UK collaborators. Exeter Dundee. Dundee's our law group. We have a poverty group in Exeter as well. The University of Oxford looking at some of the modelling. Plymouth Marine, because we're in a deltaic environment. That's clearly an important component in the National Marine Centre. Very importantly, we have an extremely strong partnership group in Bangladesh, and Paul actually went to visit those. And that's been one of the great joys of this project, is over the last, we had a period of time of building this up, we've really seen a series of partnerships evolving in Bangladesh itself, and that's been extremely valuable. We have some Indian partners who work particularly on mangroves and some of the poverty issues as well, and some of the river issues. And John has brought in a Chinese partnership as well, a partner who will work with him on some of the material you've just seen. So it's a substantial ongoing project, and it's led here from Southampton. Why do we pick deltas? Well, we have an IPCC published professor here, Robert Nichols, who's an expert on deltas. And deltas historically and currently represent highly productive ecosystem services balanced against highly vulnerable services. So this is an excellent opportunity to study a very dynamic and very productive environment. And about 500 million. We joke with the figures, but they're about the same between the projects. About 500 million people live on delta proper. Of course, in many parts of the world, deltas, where they are, there's tremendous poverty. So we are looking at the relationship between the environment and poverty, and deltas was a good way of carrying that out. If we look at some of the IPCC work, and this was done by Professor Nichols as well, they carried out looking at where populations were also sort of coinciding with sea level trends and sea level changes. And one of the things you can see is that the extreme deltas, such as the Nile, the delta we work on, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Mekong, are all established in the future as, and these actually are very conservative figures, as being areas where there will be extreme stress and migration and enhanced poverty if we don't get on with a process of understanding the relationship between these ecosystem services and poverty now. So it has been identified, and obviously the work we do here, and I think it's true of all the other projects, is we want this to be transferable. We have to generate some generic outputs from these and work together across the projects so that we can apply these in all sorts of opportunities. I think, Paul, that would be an ESPA aim. Deltas are sinking. We always get slightly embarrassed in this one because the one we're working on is sinking the least. But okay, the sea level change here is quite dramatic. But the point here is that deltas are, by their nature, very low-lying, therefore very vulnerable in terms of storminess and also in terms of sea level rise and the combination between those two. And in fact, we will see that it is a serious threat in the region of the Ganges Delta, or Ganges Brahmaputra Delta. And this is in fact, so if this is Bangladesh, where we are working on this coastal zone here. This is the famous Sundarban. Paul talked about that a little bit earlier. Famous for its tigers, and the largest mangrove forest in the world. Huge production, ecosystem service production. But of course, we have other ecosystem services that we have to consider. Some general, the general population, about 130 million over the whole, that's over the whole coastal zone. We have two, Kolkata and Dhaka are world-sized cities which are, if you like, are under threat. The Sundarbans, and you have huge supplies of water coming from the Brahmaputra and the Ganges, and in fact the Meghna down here, to making the water supply here absolutely vast, coming off and draining the Himalayas. So you have this monsoonal system, and you also have this huge melt zone and seasonal melt, resulting in catastrophic flooding, but also huge supplies of sediment and water and all the requirements that we have in the system. I don't think I need to show too much on this, but clearly projections of the future for sea level change, they're not going to flatten out or go down. We don't know exactly what they'll be, but every centimetre counts when you live a metre above sea level. So, we will be developing scenarios. This we work with Hadley Centre, the Met Centre, and they will be giving us the latest information they can and the modelling in this zone. So as you see, the zone we work in is less than 1 metre. So essentially you're living so near to sea level and this allows ingress of the sea and salination of this region. So we're seeing storminess, we're seeing sea level rise generally, and the resultants of this is the salination of this region. Also, we're seeing extraction of fresh water from the Ganges in India, and the result of that is that the seawater is now able to penetrate further and further as we get less and less fresh water with something called the Faraka barrage. What are the ecosystems? Well, okay, broadly speaking, we're looking at the marine, riverine and floodplain domains, but you can see that there's forestry and wetlands, these are fisheries, mangroves, agriculture areas. There's a lot going on in this region. It's highly productive, but also has high issues of poverty. And we will be dealing, and we're in discussions about how we'll manage this, but we're looking at the ecosystem services supporting, provisioning, and maintaining. At the moment, we're not dealing with cultural, but that can be included later on. But these are the 3 key ecosystem service groupings that we will be trying to look at. So what are the economic trends in the Delta Plain? Well, we've got a growing population, a massively growing population, although Bangladesh has done some unique things in managing its population. The population is still growing. Rising wealth and improving health, so demands, obviously these are the good things that sit within the donut, but they also have consequences. As we see rising wealth and health, we're seeing changes in dietary patterns from the cities, and these meat consumption, etc., is beginning to have a reflection on the ecosystems in the rural environment. We must remember that when people leave the rural environment and migrate, which is one of the key responses, migrate to cities, when they do so, they don't leave behind the demand for ecosystem services. When you live in a city, you still need fish, and you still need meat, and you still need water. And that has an effect on the rural areas around as well. Migration, intensification of agriculture, these things are true of many areas. What are the tasks we've set ourselves? Here's the team when we met last in Bangladesh. We'll be out there in November. We've been out there many times, but the field work is now underway. Interdisciplinary, of course, multi-scaled. We're going to have to look at this because decision makers need things in a multi-scale. It needs to be integrative because at the moment the way decisions are made is far too made up of one model here, another model here. Do you look at the world in a physical way or do you look at it in a social way? Well, you need to look at it in a sort of socio-environmental way, or as we're beginning to use here, a socio-ecological context. You can't really separate those out, and often they end up in different ministries. So one of our tasks is to try to bring together information on a far broader scale, which can be utilised in a more integrated way. That's a little bit reflected in our early research questions, relationships between ecosystem services. Participatory methods is extremely important. We have a lawyer group working with us, a legal group with specialised in this, policy and transferability. Very simply put, the structure of our project is that governance, and this is sort of stakeholder interaction, runs right the way from the project and starts and it ends with that. We have people now currently working in the field to come up with conceptual models, so sort of flow diagrams between poverty and ecosystem services. What are the relationships? And then we will try to quantify these by bringing in physical and social economic survey models. And then we will integrate that and generate scenarios, and then we'll have the policy analysis. And if we're very quick, the way we're doing the modelling integration is something John has worked a great deal on, is through systems dynamics. Now, without getting into it too much, what you're really looking is the relationships of stocks and flows, where you have complicated models and relationships. What you're trying to do is understand the linkages and relationships between them, and each of these arrows may represent just simply a value, or it could represent an entire functioning model that's looking at the relationship. So it's a dynamic model, and that's the important point. It's not a static model, it's a dynamic model you can interact with. And these things have been around since the 60s, but we're really only getting to grasp with the thresholds John was talking about, and the feedback loops and the complexity. But Southampton seems to excel in this field. We just have a lot of people who have an interest in this, and I would say it's one of the reasons why ESPA is well placed, having strong investment here. We have a great deal of interest in this area, and it offers a huge amount. What are we going to do? Initial policy drivers. We're going to go and ask the policymakers, what kind of models do you need? That sounds obvious, but it's actually quite unique. You start with the user and say, well, what questions are you asking, and how will you ask them, and what would you like the outputs to look like? We produce that model, we consider how we develop our scenarios, we run a business as usual, and we run a policy intervention that we can lay on the model and actually show a range of possible outcomes. So if you like, we're going to produce a platform in which policymakers can play games. And that's about time, it's needed. So if you're going to build a dam, test it first. If you're going to have an irrigation, test the complex input. If you're going in at one level, you may be having social economic inputs you haven't considered. So governance, the key things to do is that we will not just talk with people, but we're going to get them involved in the process. Initial policy questions, development of scenarios, and the interventions and testings. Their numbers and their weightings will actually count. Our scenario development is essentially going to be a risk framework where we will sample. Endogenous simply means the internal changes, social, economic, policy driven, and these will be the external climate ones, and we'll create narratives of the future, which we will work with policymakers. And that allows us to do a great deal of something called policy sensitivity, where we'll look at the different policy outcomes and see what the commonalities are. Because if you're a policymaker and you have to go back to your boss and say, great, I've got a plan for 20 years' time, he's not going to be pleased. What you have to come back with is say, we've got a plan for 20 years' time, but we also have a plan for now. And that's part of what policy sensitivity will be giving us. Finally, very quickly, slightly running over, one of the key drivers in the research, particularly for my interest, but I think at the centre of the project, is quantifying this poverty and ecological services relationship. Here's our study area, brought up in Bangladesh. There are poverty maps that already exist of all sorts, but the resolution is such that they don't really allow this relationship between poverty and ecosystem services to come forward. So we're going to approach this in two ways. A causal approach, which is where we simply identify what are socio-ecological groups in our study area, perhaps they're agriculture and fisheries, and then we will carry out a series of surveys, detailed PRA surveys like the other projects are doing. That will give us detailed knowledge, but not very widespread. Then we'll do associative studies. We know that there is high-resolution census data, and we've just got it a couple of days ago. It takes a lot to get hold of. And we're going to be able to spatially, statistically link that with known ecosystem services here. And the net effect of what you're trying to do at the end is something called SEA, where you link your knowledge, your detailed knowledge, with your broader knowledge. And where you see the relationships between these, you can begin to infer what exists in the gaps. So what we want to do is produce a detailed poverty map of this region, detailed relationships between poverty and ecosystem services, and then map and extrapolate those to produce a truly spatially relevant relationship between poverty and ecosystem services that allows policymakers to say something. That's called SEA. It's a methodology, small area estimates, and that's what we're busy working on now. Sorry, I slightly overrun, didn't I? That's fine. Okay, yes, thank you. Happy to.
Thank you very much for that, Craig. I'd suggest we take 5 minutes. It's now 6:30, so we come back in 5 minutes' time, and we can do the last 3 talks.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just want to thank you. That's all right. Yeah, I'm just seeing who's awake. Thank you.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah, we could go.
How many people were there today?
So hopefully he's going to get Do we have a bottle of water here? I'll get one. It's okay, I'll get it.
Maybe you should get that in.
I should chase them.
Yeah,
Water.
Oh, is that for me?
Well, you know.
Oh, well, that's very nice, thank you. And where's the, is that the one?
I think it's that one, yeah. Although, to be honest,
Yeah, that'll work.
you kind of need to hang around here because these are the microphones, and that's the microphone for the...
No, I just want to do the
Oh, the pointer. Yeah.
pointer, that's all I need.
We're on the side of shore. Holes. What's that? Where's our video person? It's leaving. The first thing I'm going to do is thank Ali.
Thank you.
Ali Simmons for ordering it. So let's get it. She's done amazing. Right. Okay, guys. We better get a start on things. We've got 3 more talks and about 40 minutes to do it in. But before I introduce Kate here, I'd just like to extend a really big thank you to Ali Simmons, who's organised most of this, who's done almost all of the work involved. And she's done a fantastic job. It's been very well publicised, I think. So Ali's sitting at the back. So many thanks, Ali. It's been fantastic. We really appreciate it. Our next talk is by Kate Schreckenberg. Kate's a lecturer in environmental sciences here, and her background is in, she's worked in development for a long time, and her particular expertise in community forestry and non-timber forest products. Let Kate take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. And Okay, that's not much. That's that one. Paul has already shown you my starting photo. In case you couldn't read it first time round, these are farmers in Uganda, in Bitereko County. It says, "Proud carbon farmer. I grow trees for global benefit." So they're being paid to grow trees. They're earning money from growing trees, which are used to offset our carbon emissions. So it sounds like a win-win for everybody, really. But as we go through the presentation, I think you'll see that it's a bit more complex than that. And there are wins and wins, but there are also possibly losses in the system and costs being imposed on people. There are some of my partners at the meeting that we had in Bangkok in July this year, which was kind of synthesizing some of the work we've done. This is one of the smaller projects that ESPA has funded. It's a conceptual framework project, and it's been going on for 2 years and is now coming to an end. And we've got partners from pretty much all over the world, and various southern partners are in there. I'll talk about them a bit more in a minute. So why are we interested in equity as a topic? Seems like a very obvious thing that everything in development should be equitable, but it isn't that easy. And in fact, mine is only one of 3 projects that ESPA has funded that are looking at different aspects of equity or social justice in ecosystem services. And it's become really an interesting topic because new values, both monetary and non-monetary, are being assigned to ecosystem services. So if you think of trees in a tropical forest, they've always been very valuable to local people as a source of timber, as a source of various non-timber forest products. All of a sudden now we impose a new value on them of biodiversity conservation and sequestering carbon, and that's a value that perhaps is not so obvious to local people, but is certainly of great interest to us in the north as we're jetting around emitting carbon. So we've got new values being assigned, new people willing to pay for ecosystem services in a different way from before. And the question is, does that new and even greater value lead to poverty alleviation? There's a lot of literature called the resource curse literature, which you may or may not be aware of, which deals with things like oil extraction and mining, diamond mining, for example. That may be obvious to some of you, but the money that comes from that isn't always spread equally or equitably amongst the people who are affected. So there's, we need to be cautious about the equity impacts of actually putting new values on ecosystem services. And in our project, our particular focus has been on the REDD+ agenda. REDD is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And it's a big program around the world. There's a lot of national governments now involved in trying to set up national REDD programs with donor aid. And those programs are very much about sustainable forest management and how to reduce emissions from changing land use in their own countries. And there are real concerns about what that means for the people living in and around those forests. What, are they going to have to change their traditional use of the forest? And all our southern partners are part of something called REDNet, which is a network, an international network, that is trying to inform advocacy organisations and civil society organisations, as well as governments in developing countries, to try and really explain to them what some of the issues are, to provide them with evidence and case studies from different areas so that they can actually work out what the implications are in their own country. And one of the southern partners, right at the beginning of this, that got me interested in putting in this proposal in the first place, was, he was telling me about the international negotiations that he went to and how people were just talking at cross purposes. So you'd have, governments talking about equity, advocacy organisations talking about equity, but there was no definition. It wasn't clear whether equity was about how much money is being distributed, or about having a place at the debating table and a place in making decisions, for example, or whether you were talking about equity between people in the north and the south, or between our generation and future generations. So, people were using this term, but it wasn't clear what was meant by it. So our aim was to produce a framework for discussing equity in the context of ecosystem service markets. And frameworks basically allow people to use the same terminology. They try and help people to talk in a way that everybody knows what they actually mean. So our framework the idea is that it can be used in planning policies or assessing policies and initiatives, and it doesn't try to be normative. It doesn't say this is what equity looks like. It tries to say these are the kind of things you want to consider when you're thinking about whether an initiative that you're planning is equitable or not. So it sets out some guiding questions and some dimensions that one needs to look at. And you could use it in various ways to establish a sort of context-specific definition of equity. So here is what our diagram pretty much looks like, our framework. You can see we start off in the middle here with the content of equity, and you'll find that a lot of the literature, we based this development of this framework on a lot of literature from justice, from political theory, from ethical sort of theory, as well as a lot of case studies that existed in the literature and amongst our partners of different ecosystem services. And a lot of the literature really only deals with distribution. It may possibly deal with procedures and decision making. Not much deals with the contextual side of things, and I'll go into each of these in more detail. And very little really talks about who counts, who are you thinking about, and what are the equity goals anyway, and then even less about who is involved in setting all of these parameters. And this gets very important when you realise that different people have different conceptions of what equity is. Then it really matters who's sitting right out here. So just to explain those different layers of the circle a bit better, the central part, the content, this example comes from work that I've done on community forestry in Nepal, where initially it was, distributive issues really came to the fore when they found that by putting a fence around community forests and trying to improve their conservation status, they were imposing a lot of costs on the poorest people who had no other tree resources to fall back on, whereas rich people had trees on their own land and so weren't quite so affected. So they started looking at benefits and costs imposed by management of the ecosystem. And then they started looking at how to distribute the benefits that were coming out. Here we've got fuel wood being distributed, and things in Nepal have gone from providing equal distribution, everybody gets an equal share, to a realization that actually some people don't need fuel wood, some people don't need timber. Everybody has their own needs, and maybe you need to divide up the benefits in terms of what people need. So that's dividing on the basis of need, or perhaps dividing on the basis of merit, who's invested most labor in managing that forest, or social welfare, by maximizing social welfare. In order to do that, you might want to sell all of your timber in one job lot and get a really good price for it, and then divide up the money. You might get more that way than having every family sell their own little bit. So there are all sorts of decisions there about how you organize your distribution. And how you organize it is determined by your procedural equity and who has a say in the decision making. And that was another big issue in Nepal, how you get to have a fair political process and how you get participation, particularly for women, for example, and the untouchable castes, the Dalits. And they've gone from having quotas, so you have to have a certain number of women and Dalits on the committees, for example, that take these decisions. They found that wasn't enough. They've actually had to give them empowerment classes and do sort of literacy classes for women and for the Dalits to actually enable them to use those positions that they've got on committees. And that addresses some of the contextual equity issues, that even if you have really fair procedures in place that should give a good distributive outcome, if people are too poor or unable to make use of the procedures, they won't get their fair share. And so you've got to look at capabilities, literacy, for example, just knowing about a project, being able to participate, access, power, are all very important issues. So that's the content of equity. Then the next ring was looking at the target and scale and who counts as a subject of equity. And one of our collaborators worked on gas extraction, natural gas, in Bolivia. And this was particularly in the Department of Tarija, which is one of 9 departments in Bolivia, but by far the smallest. It's only got 5% of the population of Bolivia, but it's got 70% of the natural gas extraction, and their income has risen enormously in the last few years. And so there's quite a debate between the regional and the national government. The national government wants to have natural gas with redistribution, so they want to redistribute some of the money, which the local government really doesn't want. They want to keep it all for Tariqa. So there's debate there, who gets to have a say of this. Which community and who in the community you talk to is also very important. The gas companies are talking, the Winhayek are indigenous people there, and rather than talking to some of their Winhayek organisations, they're actually picking off individual leaders and making agreements with those leaders, which undermines the local institutions. There's also the issue, you can look at it, because it's a marketed product, you can look at the whole value chain and realise that, okay, some benefit is coming to the local people, but actually most of the salaries and decision-making are concentrated somewhere completely different. And then you've got the generational issue. You're extracting hydrocarbons, great for the current generation, but what about the future generation there? Then the next ring was looking at the goals. Are there any equity goals? And this, again, comes very much from some of the work I've done in community forestry, which shows that if you want to achieve any kind of poverty alleviation, that's got to be an explicit goal from the beginning. You can't just tack it on at the end. And it's the same with equity. There are a lot of projects under the Fair Trade banner that really do have an explicit equity goal. But a lot of them either ignore it completely or just say, okay, we just don't want to make it any worse than it is, but we're not actually going to think about how we can make it better. And an important recognition is that equity and poverty don't necessarily co-vary. You can reduce poverty, for example, through an agroforestry scheme. You could raise aggregate income. So overall, you've alleviated poverty, but you've increased inequity because you've left out the landless people. So the two things are related, very strongly related, but you need to think of them separately. And our final layer was how the parameters of equity are set. And we had a good example from Connie McDermott at Oxford, who looked at the Forest Stewardship Council and the Programme for Endorsement of Forest Certification, which are two different certification bodies, and they work very, very differently. The FSC is NGO-driven. It gives equal votes to social, economic and environmental members, and really emphasises the NGO needs and indigenous needs. And so you can end up with an FSC standard that the industry doesn't agree with, for example. So it's kind of quite difficult sometimes for the industry. On the other hand, the PFEC is an industry-led organisation, and so the forest producers set the parameters. So their standards are sometimes criticised for being easier to apply by the forest industry. They're more modest, at least they're achievable, but perhaps they don't take into consideration some of the needs of indigenous people that much. And then very quickly, to go through the carbon farmers in Uganda case, we took our theoretical model and applied it in 4 different case studies. And one of them in Uganda is this Trees for Global Benefits project, which is developed on the Plan Vivo model, which also exists in Mexico and Mozambique. And it uses carbon finance to try and fund the planting of indigenous trees by producers on their own land. And in Uganda, it's implemented by an NGO, a conservation NGO called EcoTrust. And farmers, to participate, they have to have enough land, they have to have a bank account, and buyers, such as us, when we're offsetting our flights, purchase carbon from the farmers through EcoTrust. And EcoTrust makes a sales agreement with the farmers, and here are some trees that have grown really, really well, some terminalia after about 6 or 7 years. I have to say they're the only ones I saw that grew that well. The rest, pretty disastrous, but farmers are signing contracts for 50 years that they're planting and going to maintain trees for 50 years. They are paid right up front. So you can see they're paid all of the money in the first 10 years, which is good because it covers the main costs of establishing these trees, and it's assumed that after the trees are 10 years old, they'll be sufficiently valuable as trees for the farmers to keep them for the next 50 years or replace them as necessary. And 10% of the payment goes into a carbon community fund, which is supposed to help non-participants. And some of the equity issues that this raised were about distribution, that they'd already shifted from paying farmers not what the actual market price was. The first time I went to this project, which was before I got the ESPA funding, was 3 years ago, and they were paying farmers the actual current market price. So you get neighbouring farmers who had signed contracts at different times, and one might get $4, one might get $8 for exactly the same tree sort of setup. So they've now standardised that. They've also got this carbon community fund, which is supposed to fund other people who aren't participating, and they've got a lot of debate about how to distribute this money. Should it be pro rata, merit, need-based, or how? The real issues were around procedural equity, that farmers are signing agreements that are in English. None of them speak English. They're signing before they know what they're going to be paid and when they're going to be paid. They often wait 2 years to receive their signed copies. They're not told about what happens if they lose trees, whether they have to replace or who's going to do that. You're disadvantaging vulnerable people because they can't even participate in the first place because they don't have any land. And EcoTrust, which is a conservation NGO, is their only source of information. So they're being told it's wonderful to plant indigenous trees, whereas it would actually make a lot more economic sense in their local context to plant eucalyptus and pine, which provide very quick returns, but are not as nice from a conservation point of view. And I won't go through these too much other than at the parameter setting level. It's quite interesting that some decisions that seem very technical, like which species to plant, are actually ones that have a huge equity impact. All the farmers I spoke to said, why can't we be paid for coffee and banana? They're trees, aren't they? Aren't they sequestering carbon? And this is a decision that's happening at the national level. They're discussing that in Uganda now, which species to include. And at the project level, it's a decision by a conservation NGO. Should they allow, they could allow pine and eucalyptus, but they don't want to because they're a conservation NGO. So some of these decisions, really affect whether farmers are indeed getting a fair deal. Most of them think they are. They don't really know because they don't know the bigger picture. So information is a big issue. So just finally, as we value ecosystem services more explicitly and they're being marketed, we need a terminology to describe all those different dimensions of equity, and hopefully defining that in each context would be an inclusive process in which all participants can have a say, so that you get a definition of equity that meets everybody's needs. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kate. Our next talk is a show of sorts. Our next talk is by Karen. Oh, sorry. You've changed the talk, all right. So Kay is a postdoc in geography working with John Deering, one of the ESPA projects, and his background is also in paleoecology. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. And here I'm going to talk another ESPA project. It's about 2 years. We almost finished. It's kind of poverty and ecology, developing a new evolutionary approach. And we have several colleagues working on this project, both from China and the UK, including the Chinese Academy of Science in Nanjing, and also East China Normal University in Shanghai, also the Terry Dawson in Dundee, and the Paul Sillerton in Durham University. And John and Paul already mentioned a little bit about our project. Here I try to show the whole picture about the project, what method we have used, and our result. And okay, so the key objective of the project is we try to developing an evolutionary framework to understand the long-term dynamics of the coupled socio-ecological system, because currently one key challenge facing the kind of the sustainable community of the environment scientists is we lack the long-term data, because we all know that lots of biophysical social process, they operate over a very long time scale, different time scale from the days to months, decades, to even 100 years or 30 years. But currently our monitor data only cover about 20 or 30 years. So it's not enough, it's not long enough for us to totally understand the whole system having evolved from the past to the present. Here we try to use the data from the paleo environment studies and integrate with other socio-economic data, try to see how the whole system has been changed from the last maybe 100 years. And upon that, the other objective of the project is why we try to communicate with our pure scientific research with the public and make them easily understand what we do. And we try several different visualization kind of tools to easily to communicate our result with the public, kind of different stakeholders. And we choose China as our study region. Everyone knows that in the last several decades, China has been experiencing a dramatic change in terms of the economic development and the poverty alleviation, also with lots of environment problems. So here we choose the, we choose the low Yangtze River Basin in East China, which is one of the most developed regions in China. Here is the Shanghai, and you see there are lots of lakes scattered in the Yangtze River Basin. So give us plenty of paleo information we can use. So we choose 4 different catchment in the Yangtze River Basin with different catchment size from the 100 square kilometer to about 220 square kilometers. And within each lake settlement, within each lake catchment, we choose 4 counties with different social economic states, normally with different, the wealthy levels. And they all have the similar character. In, for example, the population is about 1 million in one county, and also the county area is about 1,000 square kilometers. Farmers' income per capita per year is increasing from the west to the east, because the people living near Shanghai is more wealthy compared with the people in the poor areas. And so we identify several key services in terms of the ecosystem services, regulating service and the provisioning service. The regulating service mainly from the paleo environment record. It includes the water purification, the soil stability, the air quality, biodiversity, different kind of thing. And the provisioning service mainly from the agriculture sector. The food, the food production, the timber, the aquatic, different kind of thing. We also examine the drivers from the population, the economic GDP, and the climate signals, and also we review the policy and the government to see how this whole system has involved both the socio-ecological and the different kind of thing. And so I will take one Shucheng. John mentioned previously to show the whole method we have used. And this is Shucheng County. From here we can see the landside image shows the 2010 and 1989, about 20 years, actually, the landscape has been changed dramatically in terms of urbanization and the intensive agriculture. In terms of the paleo environment, we take the course from the lake settlement, and which can cover about 100 or 1,000 years, and it includes lots of information about the vegetation, about the soil, different kind of thing. And we take this course, we take lots of course and measure the dating, give them dating chronology kind of thing, and we also do the lab analysis to build different kind of curves. And so this is one Shucheng County we have done. We already do other lakes in this region, and I will show quickly about the data we got is from the last 1 century, and mainly the water quality, sediment quality, the soil stability, the biodiversity, air quality, and the green line in the middle is kind of integrated index about to represent the whole regulating service having changed. We can see from the 1900 to 1915, the founding of New China, actually everything seems very stable. They didn't change too much. Even after the founding of New China to the 1980s, it's still very stable. Only from the 1980s, everything seemed very changed dramatically, and they all declined. Exception the biodiversity, we saw maybe kind of the agriculture intensification because of that. But the soil stability, this is the water quality, this is the sediment quality, this is the sediment regulation, also the soil stability. whether they decreased or they kind of increasing the variability. So it's very evident, very obvious to show the 100 years how the natural kind of the regulating service have been evolved from the past to the present. So this is a regulating service. We also, examine the provisioning service from the agricultural sector. It's about the green products, the aquatic timber, the fruit, livestock, different kind of thing. And the red one in the middle, in the bottom one, this one is the provisioning service. It's also kind of integrated index. We can see from the new funding of China, everything from the agriculture sector seems improved very quickly, and during the last 40 years. So it's very, very obviously seen to show actually all the provisioning service have increased. We also plotted the provisioning service index from the previous slide, also the regulating service index, to show during the last 50 years there's kind of clearly trade-off. On one side, the provisioning service all increased very quickly. At the other side, the regulating service, the green line, the green bubble, have been decreased. And as the time going, this kind of gap become more and more larger. So it's very interesting. And okay, so this is one county I showed in the Shucheng County. I don't want to show all the county because we have lots of data, but I just want to show very quickly. Okay, it didn't work. Yeah, in the 4 counties, we can see clearly the pattern of the trade-off in all the regions. We have the similar trend. This is the provisioning service and the regulating service and the provisioning service index. And if we plot the provisioning service, this is plot against the time. If we plot the provisioning against the regulating, we can see they are slightly different patterns. In these two, they show some kind of irreversible, because you see, in the last several years in this county, the provisioning service actually didn't increase. That means has been decreased. But the regulating service didn't go back, because most people think, okay, I damaged the environment. One day, if I stop, maybe the environment can recover, can go back. But actually, our data shows some kind of non-linear of the system. It kind of dynamic, it's not linear. Sometimes you can't go back. So so this one, we can see the bottom right one is even the provisioning service didn't increase at a certain time, but the environment still, go down. And so John talked a little about the water quality. We examine each services. We use different time series, the kind of the models, and use some sequential test methods to identify some tipping point in the water quality. So clearly there's some tipping points happened in 1990s. We can see the different pictures before that and after that is very crucial. And in terms of the critical translation, so it's very profounding, it's very striking in terms of the poverty. Kind of, if everything happened like this, it must be very seriously. So this kind of early warning signal John mentioned. So I'll show you. So this is only the one lake. I put all the lakes in our study region, the 4 lakes. They all show the similar pattern. So it's very clearly evident to show kind of the environment management, how serious the situation is. This is the water quality. We also examine other services, soil stability. Although they didn't show the very uniform change, but they also show some certain level of the increasing variability, show the whole system maybe getting more and more unstable. There's one theory called, I think most people know about the environment Kuznets curve. It says in one region, at the beginning, when you study increase your economic development, maybe at the beginning, the environment degradation the environment will be damaged very quickly. But after you continue increase your income or your economic development, at a certain level, actually your environment will be getting better and better. So this is a very Euro trajectory. Most of the developed country has go through from the American or the European countries. And lots of people say this is, and currently lots of developing countries, they're following this kind of trajectory. They make the policy, they develop the economy. They say, okay, this kind of getting dirty first, clean up later. When I have enough money, I can to cure the kind of environment. But we all know that it's not very sustainable. There's some problem. We have to find a new way to overcome this kind of trajectory. And we plot our data. This is economic growth per capita in our region. This is environment degradation. The upper one means the bad environment. So we can see in our 4 regions, actually, there's no sign of the kind of decouple from the economic growth with the environment degradation. So it's very striking. So here comes the conclusion. So the paleoenvironment source of regulating service can provide a new important long-term perspective on the ecological sustainability and degradation. And the trade-off in our region in the last 100 years is very clear and unsustainable. And the environment approaching already in the critical transition in our study region since 1990s, 80s. And there's no sign of decoupling economic growth from the environment degradation in our study region. Thank you.
Good. All right.
Do I get an intro?
You do.
Thank you.
And our last talk today is from James. James is a lecturer in the complexity sciences and the electronics and computer sciences. I believe, what was your research interest? I've written down here.
Bit of this, bit of that, bit of the other.
Why is the Earth system the way it is? How are we affecting it? I mean, that's why you summed up your research interest.
That's a fair assessment. Thank you, Felix. Okay, I'm the last act. I appreciate it's been a very long day, so hopefully this will be relatively painless. We have a long way to go before all of humanity's basic needs are met. Now, you may think that ensuring access to clean water is a relatively simple problem. We've had the technology available for several thousand years. It's called a well. But the fact that 1.5 million people die every year tells us that this is in fact a very complex problem. And an important complicating factor is our current levels of development are not sustainable. John already showed this picture earlier. I just want to point out that for some of these planetary boundaries, we seem to be in the green. For example, chemical pollution or maybe atmospheric aerosol loading. But if you look in the parentheses here, that's because we largely don't understand our impacts. Certainly we're getting a better idea of what's going on with climate change, but really the thing that causes great concern is rates of biodiversity loss. Some people have proposed that we are in the middle of what could turn out to be one of the greatest mass extinction events in the history of life on Earth. Our current levels of development are not sustainable. And there's been a tremendous increase in sustainable development, in notions of sustainability, and that's reflected in the number of times that the word sustainable appears in English text. I'm showing it from around 1950 here, when nobody was really using the word sustainable, and it's increased many thousands of times to present day. Now, if we were to continue on this trend, by 2036, the word sustainable appears, on average, every page. A little time later, it's going to be in every single sentence. And if we continue at this rate, by the start of the 22nd century, everything written in English language would be nothing but the word sustainable repeated again and again and again. Clearly, the rate of increase in the word sustainable is unsustainable. Now, you may think that the rate of increase is constant because it's a straight line, but actually if you look here, it's not a linear axis, this is a logarithmic axis. Every value here is 10 times greater than the previous one, and when you see this kind of linear log plot, it's telling you that you're looking at an exponential function. The reason we use a logarithmic plot to show it is because if you try to show this on a linear axis, you wouldn't see any of these values here because these values up here are so much greater. You see nothing, and all of a sudden you see a great increase in the value of the function that you're looking at. You would see something like this. This is the world population over the last 12,000 years or so. And you can see for most of that history, you can't even see the numbers because in the orders of hundreds of thousands or millions. It's only been the last couple of thousand years, in a particular last century, in the last few decades, that there's been this tremendous increase in the global population. If Homo sapiens are around 1 million years old or so, it took about 1 million years for us to reach our first billion, but thereafter our rate of increase has increased. There's been a tremendous increase in the last 20 or 30 years. In fact, during this period, the world's population doubled in a little over 40 years. As well as this tremendous increase in the numbers of people, there's also been a tremendous increase in the amount of energy that our global civilization is consuming. I think it's a quite remarkable statistic. Take the 200-year period, so around the middle of the Industrial Revolution, around 1790 and up to 1990, a little over 20 years ago, and imagine all the energy consumed in that period. Every piece of firewood, lump of coal, barrel of oil, volume of gas, and then electricity produced by nuclear fission or renewable resources. All that energy we used, again, in the 20-year period since 1990 to 2010. And that is what this energy looks like over an historical context. And again, you can't see most of it because the values are so very low, because for most of our history, we were limited in the amount of work that we could do in our muscles and in the muscles of our animals that might draw a plough or pull a cart. It's only been the discovery of high-energy fossil fuels, high-energy density fossil fuels, since the Industrial Revolution, the discovery and the utilisation of coal and oil and gas, that there has been this tremendous exponential increase in the amount of energy that the global civilization is using. Currently, it's around 15 million watts, or that's about 15 terawatts. It's most probably more like 16 terawatts now. And this is largely powered by fossil fuels. Now, of course, the only thing we can say with certainty is that these fuels will run out. They are a finite resource. And the question is, what are we going to replace them with? And there's much debate and discussion, and it's a controversial subject, the notions of peak oil. But in a historical context, it seems reasonable that this tremendous increase will be matched with a tremendous decline in our consumption of fossil fuels, as we will get hold of them as quickly as we can and we will use them all up. So what do we replace them with? Well, I guess the current assumption is there will be some kind of mix of renewable power, renewable resources, wind, wave, tidal, solar, geothermal. But there's something fundamentally wrong with this picture. It assumes that this tremendous increase in energy that we've seen over the past few decades suddenly stops, and that we collectively decide that we've had enough energy and that our energy use will remain constant for the foreseeable future. When you're looking for the load or the requirement that you want from renewable resources, you should be most probably looking at multiples of our current energy use, perhaps 5 times as much energy. And of course we have no idea how we're going to do that. We don't have the science, the technology, we certainly don't have the infrastructure in place to be able to produce so much renewable energy. So there's a question of timing here. We don't seem to have an awful lot of time to think about putting in place the alternatives to fossil fuels in order to keep the lights of our civilization on. But arguably, there's a much more important reason why we should be transitioning away from a carbon-based economy. This is a map of temperature deviations. There's an average temperature here. It's the temperature between 1950 to 1980. And if a region is dark blue, it's about 2 degrees cooler. And if a region is shaded in this red colour, it's about 2 degrees warmer than this average temperature. And we see temperature changes from around the end of the 19th century. Now, we've known for quite some time, theory has told us that if we increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere through burning fossil fuels, you increase the radiative forcing in the Earth's climate, you increase the amount of heat, and we would detect that increase in heat by observing increased temperatures. And indeed, this is what we see. So the increase in temperature, that's locked in. Even if we were to instantaneously stop emitting any kind of carbon dioxide right now, because of the resonancy time of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere and other processes, we would still be locked into a certain amount of cooling. Now, by the middle of this century, by around 2050, we're going to start seeing some significant impacts of climate change, and we also could be seeing the greatest number of people who have ever lived. If projections are correct, by the middle of this century there could be another there could be in total 8 or 9 billion people. It may increase, hopefully it will stabilise and decrease. So we have the element here of a perfect storm. By 2050 we're going to have to be producing at least 50% more food, at least 50% more water, and at least 50% more energy. Depending on who you talk to, this could actually be multiples. It could be 2 or 3 times more food, water and energy that we currently produce. And somehow we're going to have to do all that at the same time as actually decreasing the impacts that we're having on the planetary system. If our current levels of development are not sustainable, how are we going to be able to do all this additional work on the Earth system without making it any worse? Well, that's the starting assumption or the starting question for this new undergraduate module that we're running next year called Global Challenges. It's a very ambitious module. It's got some big questions it wants to ask. And at the moment, 80 students have signed up to it. and it's going to be largely delivered by 8 guest lecturers. And it's going to look at factors such as population pressures. And you may assume that population pressures are largely responsible, or at least a kind of a sufficient explanation for why there are issues with food security or energy security. But it's important to remember that the majority of food, the majority of energy is consumed by a minority of the world's population, people like us, people who live in industrialized civilizations. And that there are close relationships between food security and energy security. Over 40% of corn grown in the United States now doesn't feed humans, it feeds cars via biofuels. And as fuel prices go up, food prices go up, fuel prices go up, the two systems are tightly intertwined. The University of Southampton, as we've been hearing about tonight, is a world centre in ecosystem services, and we're going to be talking about that. How do we value natural capital? But financial systems as well, human systems, social systems are important. We live in an increasingly interconnected global finance system. You know, the global crash of 2007, 2008 shows us that events on one side of the world can profoundly affect events on the other. And if we want to get a handle on global challenges, then we must be substantially with governments, transnational governments, going beyond the nation state as the paradigm by how we self-organise ourselves at a global scale. And again, we need to think about how all that happens under the ever-present consequences of climate change. So these are important big questions, and it's innovative in content. It's also going to be innovative in the way in which we want to run the course. We're going to get students together in multidisciplinary teams, and they're going to progress through the course together. One thing that employers of our graduates tell us is that they love the fact that our students are very specialised, they know their field very well, but they want students to be able to reach out outside of their particular discipline and talk to other people who may not have any idea what they're going on about, may not have the same kind of background. So for example, if you take a random student who asks, what does a philosopher look like? They may say something a little like this. It's kind of an old guy with a beard who talks in impenetrable sentences. If you ask again another student, what does a computer scientist look like? Maybe it's something like this. Someone with a fetishness for technology and maybe an inability to talk to non-binary systems. And if you are to ask a computer scientist or a philosopher, what does maybe a natural scientist, a biologist look like? They may say something like this. It's a guy, sometimes with a beard, almost always with glasses, wearing a white coat and looking at things really intently. So from an employability point of view, it's our responsibility to try and equip our students with the best kind of suite of skills. But arguably there's a much more important reason, and it's an intergenerational responsibility that we've got. Our students, the young people alive today, didn't cause these global challenges. They didn't overpollute and overconsume or put in place the policies which have led to us imperiling the very systems in which we all rely on. But they're the ones who are going to have to live with them. And if future generations are going to survive and prosper, they're the ones who are going to have to fix them. So it's our responsibility to try and give them the best start in which they will need in order to address these challenges. And then going beyond our students and members of staff within the university, we want to reach out to our local community. And so we propose to run a TEDx event around March next year. Some of our more eminent academics here may be asking, who's TED? Well, it's not who, it's what. TED stands for Technology, Education and Design, and it's something of a global brand now. They run events kind of like this, but they typically last all day, but they are very broad in scope. Some TED and some TEDx events attract thousands of people, and you will pay thousands of dollars to attend them, but some are much more grassroots level, and this is what we're proposing. So sometime around March, we'll have a full day of people talking about essentially sustainability. What's Southampton contributing? Its university, staff members, its students, but also people in the local environment. What are they contributing to notions of sustainable development? If you'd like to learn more about Global Challenges module and the TEDx event, please do check out these URLs, and thank you very much. I've finished.